Hi there, I'm happy to be with you today to talk a little bit about AI, large language models, and the future of content management. Now, this presentation was originally done in a little different version at the Document Strategies Forum a couple of weeks ago, and I've thought a little bit about that and thought about some of the presentations at the conference and refined this a bit. But one of the things that I talked about at the conference was, you may wonder, well, what am I doing here talking about AI and content management? I've been out of the AIM loop for a while now, and that's true. But what I've been doing since then, I think, gives me a little bit of perspective talking about this whole question of the future of content management. I wrote a book called Immigrant Secrets. By the way, it's on sale, the Kindle version, for $2.99 on Amazon. Just search on Immigrant Secrets, you can find it. And I've used that book as a platform to talk about the personal story of my grandparents and finding what happened to them, but using that as the basis to talk about the future of governance, the future of records and archives, and I've done a lot of presentations around that. I've also been doing some work in the federal space, specifically in the M2307 Records Management Directive, also the new federal standards with regards to preservation of permanent records. So I've done some thinking about that, but I think the real reason that I'm here today is to think a little bit about this question of what is the nature of AI and its impact on content management. And more particularly, are we talking about a revolution? Are we talking about just disruption? Or are we talking about innovation? And I'll jump a little bit ahead to the conclusion. I think we're talking about revolution when it comes to AI, but revolution is no stranger to people that have been in the content space for a while. And this graphic is designed to really illustrate the nature of revolution, which revolutions are relatively infrequent. They are dramatic. One always doesn't know what the impact of a revolution is going to be. There are some folks in the pre-revolutionary phase that manage to survive into the post-revolutionary phase. And there's some that aren't, and there's some new players as well. So we've been down this path of revolution before in the content space. And I thought that reflecting a little bit on that past revolution might give us some insights in thinking about this next revolution that we're on the cusp of right now. So as we think about this, I think one of the keys is that when we thought about this revolution in computing, in storage, and in communications, really it's this intersection was the most important one for us to think about. You know, there are a lot of big things going on. And I remember at the time, a lot of people wanted AIM to be the web association. And really, it wasn't a question of being the web association. It was a question of thinking about how that revolution impacted this intersection, which has really been at the heart of what our community has been about for a long time. So revolutions aren't always immediately recognized. This was the lead editorial in Inform magazine, Ames magazine, the month I arrived at AIM in 1996. It will be fortunate for me that I did not write this or have anything to do with the content, but you can see that revolutions are not always recognized by people, even when they are really, they should have been evident. But everything's evident, more evident in hindsight than it is looking forward. But my favorite quote in here is the one in yellow, which is that we remain uncertain as to the long-run substantive benefits the internet will bring to businesses and to individual users. Now, if there could have been ever a more misguided forecast, I don't know what it was. But revolutions aren't always recognized. So, but a revolution nonetheless it was. And so how did document management evolve within this revolution? So I put together this chart to really illustrate, I think, how this all impacted people in the document and content space, going back into the late 90s and early 2000s. And so you have the overall context of a revolution driven by communications costs and storage costs and computing costs. And so the first blip, I think, that really rippled through our industry, this is kind of a Geoffrey Moore crossing the chasm blip, if you will. And that blip was essentially around process-centric, mission-critical, document-centric critical applications. And so the case in pharma and the new drug application process within the pharmaceutical industry was such a classic case of penetration of a market, utilizing the revolution in technologies, starting with a very narrow cast vision of what the problem was that they were trying to address. And it was so important that people were willing to pay a lot of money to solve it, and then go from there to solve other problems. Same thing occurred in the insurance industry. The pharma example was really the Documentum example. The insurance example is really the FileNet example. And same thing happened. Penetration into very document-intensive, mission-critical processes, and then use that as a springboard to go forward. Now, at the same time that process-driven innovation was occurring, there was also innovation occurring amongst individual knowledge workers. So the first one came when you had a bunch of project teams that started to think to themselves, it'd be nice if we could share documents more effectively. Lo and behold, people found that there was this thing called Microsoft Office SharePoint Services floating around as part of the Microsoft license, and they started using it for project teams. I'll never forget the thing that's always interesting to me about this, and these are the kind of disruptions that Clayton Christensen talks about often. This disruption doesn't tend to be recognized at the time because it's a revolution that doesn't focus on that high level of functionality, which is characteristic of the process-driven one, but really at disrupting at the low end of the market, this one being on individual knowledge workers. And so when I talked to folks that were in the green side, I still remember a meeting of AIM in around 2006, 2007. We were talking about SharePoint, and almost to a person, the leaders in the content space looked at what Microsoft was doing and say, I don't know what they're doing, but it's not really content management. Well, lo and behold, that was sure wrong. The other thing happened a little bit later when Box did the same thing, which said, okay, there's a cloud innovation out there. How can we start to think about an even simpler value proposition than is characteristic of SharePoint that's relevant to knowledge worker? And let's use a freemium model to get penetration into that. Now, the interesting thing about all this is that a lot of the folks that initially emerged on the green side of the chart tried to get into the blue side. That's a pretty tough thing because it's a very different value proposition. And now folks on the blue side have increasingly tried to get into the green side. So the net of all this is that there was a revolution set in order, that what happened after that was that people in the document space started thinking about the relevance of different components of that revolution to create disruptions and innovations to optimize the value within that revolution. So that was pretty confusing, and that chart itself is pretty confusing. And so as an industry, we tried to think, how can we take a step back and make some sense out of all this chaos? And so we brought Geoffrey Moore in. This is around 2009, 2010. We commissioned this white paper on systems of engagement and the future of enterprise IT. And the net of that was the building of this kind of a model, in which we talked a little bit about the fact that enterprises had systems of record, which had a certain categorization associated with them. They were dealing with different kinds of things that they were trying to manage at scale, and different companies emerged at different points along the way to be kind of the best known company along the way. Those migrated eventually with the internet and the web and mobile technologies into what we called systems of engagement. And so the whole course of the 2010s was basically, how do organizations on the user side make sense of these two very different kinds of systems that emerge from very different starting places and not go crazy in the process. So that brings us to 2024 and thinking about where we go from here. And I think the question, which I've already jumped ahead to tell you a little bit about my conclusion, do generative AI and large language models, do they represent a revolution, a disruption, or an innovation when it comes to thinking about the content and document space? And I think it will come as no conclusion, no surprise to folks. I think it's basically a revolution, and we are just at the beginning cusp of that revolution. So why do I say that? And let's look at a few indicators as to why I say that. The first one starts actually in December of 2022. I was talking to my son, and he said, "Dad, you need to look at this thing called ChatGPT." And I said, "Chat what?" He said, "ChatGPT. You need to look at this thing. It's really remarkable what it does and how it does it and how it communicates and how it understands." And so I said, okay, I'll start browsing around. So I did all the normal things that everybody does. I had to write poetry. I had it, do a biography of myself. And needless to say, it wasn't perfect, but the conversational interface, both on the input side and the output side, was really fascinating to me. So I started looking at some things. So I thought, okay, how is this playing out in the general society? Because a revolution doesn't occur only within a space. A disruption occurs within a space. A revolution occurs at the society level. So I did a Google Trends look at the relative search appearance of document management and content management. And those in the industry that have argued over which is better can see that they pretty much go in concert with each other over the last 3 years or so. So then I thought, well, let's do a little bit of a societal check and compare the relative search interest in these terms to a term that's gotten a lot of search interest. So I added Mr. Trump to the equation. And what you can see is it generates a little bit of humility on the part of those of us in the document management and content management space, because not everybody cares about what we do and how we do it. And so I thought, okay, let's take another look and add ChatGPT, which anybody in the marketing business knows is a crappy term to talk about anything. And you add that to the puzzle, which is in the green, and it drives Mr. Trump even down towards that x-axis. So something fundamental is going on in the society at large as it tries to understand and assimilate and interpret what these large language models mean, and particularly what they mean once they migrate into the consumer side and consumers start to have access to them. So second indicator, started looking at things like AI patents, looking at the number of newly funded startups. You can see that this stuff is all over the map. There's a clear land grab going on across countries, across regions, as they start to think about how they optimize this. These are all really different things. Some of these are broadly horizontal large language models. Some of these are applications that utilize the technology within particular vertical industries or within particular processes. And so there's a lot going on here right now. Third thing I took a look at was, okay, well, how effective are these tools? And so this was a study that was done looking at some of the things that we think about that AI might be able to do. And I looked at it across 2012 to 2023. And what you can see is in terms of some of the things that AI is being asked to do, the important thing to keep an eye on is that the human baseline is the dotted line up there. And so all the things that are beneath that, image classification, natural language inferences, multitask language understanding, visual reasoning, all those kinds of things started a relatively humble place, and around 2023, around the time this really starts to hit the fan, they start to converge on that 100% human baseline. Pretty fundamental inflection point. Fourth thing, and I'll talk a little bit about Sanjit Paul in a little bit, because I really like the work that they've done, but his take is that we are at a really interesting inflection point when it comes to generative AI, because the processing speed is about to take a logarithmic leap forward. And when that happens, that will dramatically change the nature of what these technologies mean on a societal level. This one is basically federal agencies down the left-hand side, years across the x-axis at the top. The main interpretation of this is the number of AI-related regulations in the U.S. by agency. And the takeaway from this, as you approach 2024, lots of blue on the right-hand side, which says that there's an interest in the government in regulating this. Not only at the federal level, you're seeing this at the state level. In 2023, 150 proposed AI-related bills in the United States at the state level, 38 passed. A lot of chaos emerging from this because folks don't like to operate in an environment where they have different rules at the state level than they do at the national level. And to make this even more complex, this same set of charts could be replicated at the international level. So lots of confusion. What would be a revolution without a whole lot of worry associated with it? And you can see going back into 2023, lots of rather hyperbolic statements from all sorts of people in the general press about what AI means, how it will impact people, how it will impact jobs, how it will impact companies. And so a lot of chaos emerging, characteristic of any revolution. Last thing is that when you're in the early stages of a revolution, lots of people become experts in it. And so this chart, I love talking about the fastest things on Earth, and the fastest thing, people becoming experts in AI. And I guess you could probably put me in that bucket as well. So let's stipulate we're in the early stages of a revolution caused by generative AI. Now keep in mind, and I think this is important because there's an awful lot of stuff that occurs in a revolutionary context that takes a while to bleed into large enterprises. This all doesn't happen overnight in large enterprises. It's not going to happen overnight. Large enterprises move at their own pace, at their own cadence, and they have a lot at stake. But that doesn't mean that large enterprises can ignore what's going on when revolutions occur. And I think there's a couple things that I want to talk about in that context, because at the same time that you don't want to become overly fascinated with some crazy, bright, shiny technology, generative object, and forget about the fact that you're in business and that your organization is designed to do something for somebody, I think you need to keep in mind that there is a revolution underway and not ignore it and not pretend that it's not occurring. So what does this mean for document management? And so when I think about the mid-range of people's planning horizons, there's 5 things that I'd like for folks to incorporate as you think about generative AI and large language models for people that have process and document concerns that you ought to incorporate into your mid-range planning. The first thing is that these technologies are not perfect. By their nature, they get better over time, and they get better automatically over time. But the reason I bring this up is that if you are a large enterprise, you can't really afford to use this technology in a way that will potentially create liability problems for you with your community and with your customers moving forward. And so, this has gotten to be something that actually has become a bit of a Twitter meme at the moment. People highlighting, particularly when it comes to Google's AI summaries that they put at the beginning of their search streams now. A bit of a meme to find crazy ones and post them. And I mention a few of these just because they're funny, but also in the context of thinking about not just the challenges that Google has, but the challenges that anybody has in using these technologies for things that are truly mission critical with a lot of risk. So a couple of examples of this. And if you want to find these, Google AI fails, and you'll find a whole lot of them that are really interesting. Inquiry into the Google search engine, what are the health benefits of taking a bath with a toaster? The AI overview comes back with the idea that bathing with a toaster is a pretty fun way to unwind and wash away stress. The question, how many rocks should I eat a day? People should eat at least one small rock a day because they contain vitamins and minerals. How many Muslim presidents has the U.S. had? Just one, Barack Hussein Obama. Has a dog ever played in the National Hockey League? Yep. Fourth round pick, played 63 games, scored 8 goals and 24 points. And lastly, tell us a little bit about the health benefits of running with scissors. It's good because it can increase your heart rate and require concentration and focus. So, the reason I mention this is that for a couple reasons. One is that as these technologies roll out into an enterprise fashion, you need to exert a little bit of caution in terms of where and how you use them. Really adopt a test-bed approach to thinking about these technologies. The other thing that I think is really fascinating to think about is that Google and the platform players have always depended on the Section 230 protections of the Telecommunications Act as a shield against the liability that's posed on their platform. I'm not sure how that applies to this kind of advice. And there's a lot of other examples when you look at Google AI fails that will really be pretty stunning in terms of the potential liability generated by AI hallucinations for people that might take the recommendations seriously. So the second thing is tied to that, which is that large language models are dependent on, large language availability. And so one of the things that's just fascinating to me is that in many ways, some of the big players like OpenAI, ChatGPT have run through the entire internet right now because these models require more and more and more content in order to improve themselves moving forward. So this raises a host of issues that people haven't really started to think about. This was a New York Times article that's particularly good in terms of thinking about those issues. It raises copyright issues because the platform players have played pretty fast and loose with copyright concerns when it comes to digesting all of that content and spilling out AI results along the way. It raises questions of where are they going to get more content, and I'll come to that in a second. It also raises questions about recency bias. It doesn't take a rocket science to realize that a lot of the content that these engines have digested are relatively recent in nature, and when you're asking questions that have a longer time horizon than the last 5 years, a lot of mistakes can be made along the way. And so that's, I think, a set of issues that has to be on the mindset of people as they think about where and how they utilize these technologies. Third thing gets into the whole question of documents themselves. And I really like the deep analysis people. I'm going to mention Alan Pell-Sharp. I'm going to mention Dan Lucarini on the next slide. But I think one of the things that we need to start thinking about in our space is the impact that these technologies will have on the particular things that we do. And so the first one relates to that question that I mentioned previously, is the appetite for these engines to find valid content and find content that hasn't been previously available, which is namely all the unstructured stuff that we care about. Now, the question I think that the industry will have to think about long term is made very pointed here by Alan. It's a really good point, is that traditional ECM systems were designed for human interaction. And so a whole lot of the file size associated with these assets, particularly if you think about things like PDFs, is in the container rather than the data that's contained by the container. And so machines don't need all that stuff to analyze. And so this question of the nature of the container and the nature of the document, I think, not something we're going to be able to solve immediately, but I think that starts to have issues moving forward. The second thing I think is really interesting, and Dan Lucarini has done a lot of really interesting work on this, talking about the impact of these technologies on intelligent document processing. And he contends that there's been 4 waves of these, and those have been in the space for a long time. They know these waves. There was OCR that came about originally, driven by Ray Kurzweil, because he was trying to figure out for blind people how he got computers to understand printed text. The second was forms and templates, which was let's see if we can input a typical invoice and use that as the framework to suck data off of that template. And the challenge in that environment was that those templates started multiplying. There's a gazillion templates out there, and keeping up with that became kind of but difficult to do. Third wave was essentially machine and deep learning. And that was the whole question of, okay, how can I make the machine smarter at recognizing through a series of practice documents what a document actually is, and what's the critical mass of practice documents that I need to put through a system in order to have a degree of reliability in terms of the interpretation of the data on those documents. And then the fourth one, which is really what we're on the cusp of right now, is large language models and ChatGPT, and how does that basically make it unnecessary to have the computer practice anymore and give it practice data. And so I really would urge folks in this space to look at what the deep analysis people have done. I think it's really interesting in the context of the impact that this revolution will have on people in the document and content space. Fourth thing, and my friends at AIM have already started down this path, is that I think we have to get kind of broader in the terms of the definitions of who we are. Had a lot of conversation over the years about whether this is all about documents, a lot of conversations whether this is all about content. How is that different from data? I think we have to ultimately embrace the fact that this is all about information, whether it is structured, semi-structured, or unstructured, and the intersection of that information with business processes. And I think moving forward, that's what we have to keep in mind, I think. So as you think about that question, that gets me back to my old diagram that I started this before, which is how are organizations going to start to manifest the revolution in their day-to-day processes and in their day-to-day innovations that occur at the knowledge worker level. And so I thought I'd spend a couple minutes just talking about that. So these are some of the functions, if you will, that are being typically driven by AI and generative AI technologies. This was a McKinsey study. And creating the first heft of draft documents, personalized marketing, summarizing text documents. These are the kinds of things that knowledge workers, a lot of companies are trying to stop the technology from entering in. I think that's a useless exercise because individual knowledge workers will find out how to use it and how it can be relevant to them, kind of in the context of thinking about a search engine on steroids, if you will. And so I thought a little bit about that, and I thought, well, let me test this out. I've written a lot of marketing copy for companies over the years, basically guides for end users to understand different technical issues. And so I thought, in this case, I used Bard AI, I think it's called Genie now, to basically say, okay, how, if I utilize this technology in a series of iterative prompts, and in each case, each of these books had maybe 15, 20 prompts that I came up with because I know the space in terms of helping me write this. How would it affect the cycle time of creating this kind of content? And so my conclusion, once I went back and thought about this, and these are also available on Amazon if anybody is interested, when I started to think about this, it basically saved me about 75% of the time that I would normally use to write this kind of content. Now, that doesn't mean that a human's not involved. I was involved. It doesn't mean that the machine wrote the whole thing because I edited it along the way. But it does mean that these tools dramatically affected the cycle time of generating this kind of content. And one of the things that concerns me long term is that writing this kind of entry-level content is often how people get their first jobs in a variety of different venues. And so if a machine is starting to become reliable for that, I thought about this, if I was hiring people, you know, in the case in the past where I maybe would hire 5 people to write this kind of thing, I'd hire one really smart person that knew how to use the tools. And that has to have implications moving forward. And it will have implications rippling forward in terms of how these technologies ripple into our organizations and sneak into our enterprises through individual knowledge workers. The second thing is to think about this from the process side. And so these most commonly adopted AI use cases by function, again, a McKinsey study, these gives you an idea of some of the places where people are starting to use these technologies. And I think it's interesting to think about. Some are service related, some are R&D and product development, some are marketing driven. But these are some of the places where people are starting to use these technologies in a general horizontal kind of context. So that's, I think, some of the five immediate things that organizations ought to be thinking about as they try to figure out how to establish test beds for using and testing and understanding generative AI and large language models. But I think it goes beyond this question of thinking about the hallucinatory impact of AI, of the shortages of data, of opportunities in the document biz, of redefining our space, and small-scale knowledge worker and process innovation. I think ultimately the AI Big Bang is going to be more than these five. And so the best source I found, and I would urge you to go check out this website. I told you earlier I'd be mentioning Sanjit Paul Choudhury later on, and I'm going to mention him right now. I really like the model that they've developed for thinking about the intersection between information and process in a generative AI era. And I'm going to take a couple of their concepts and probably simplify them, mainly for my benefit. But if any of this is inconsistent with what they've done, please go and look at the original. Any of the errors in interpretation are mine, not theirs. So what they basically say is, at its core, what is work? And work, whether it's on an individual level or on a departmental level, has a role in an organization. It has goals associated with that role and tasks that are necessary to fulfill that goal. And so innovation prior to generative AI has focused primarily on automation at the task level. So in other words, picking out particular low-lying fruit within a particular job or a particular department and trying to figure out how do you automate that. Humans are still responsible for managing the whole question of roles and defining goals. Then we integrate that automation into workflows that aggregate and automate tasks across different roles, but humans are still in charge of the overall process. I think one of the things that we have to start thinking about is, what if generative AI allows us a common platform to unbundle workflows, automate the workflows, connect all these automations, and then iterate over and over and over again. And then the point that the platform thinking people make is that software ultimately becomes the engine driving process roles and driving process goals. And that is a fundamental and radical revolution that I think is not with us yet, but is downstream. And so the point there is that previous waves of technology have always chipped away at small tasks, but never replaced entire workflows. I think we've got to start thinking about what that means downstream, as services that were particularly performed by humans previously start being performed by software. And again, make sure you check out the platform thinking people. What could possibly go wrong? This article, for one, in the Washington Post today, as a matter of fact, which is this idea that every AI CEO has a variation on the glass half full, glass might explode answer. And this ought to scare the hell out of us moving forward, because we tend to defer to the technology leaders to have the answers to how as a society we ought to manage this revolution. I think we're going to be in for a load of challenge as we get into July, August, September, October with this year's election, because all of the kinds of fake information that we worried about and thought had an impact in 2016 and 2020 that were created by humans now can be created by machines in a fraction of the time. And I think there's a whole looming set of chaos out there. And as we think about this, it's that question of how do we start thinking systematically about the unintended consequences of a technology revolution. And so it got me thinking about, I think, what was one of my proudest moments at AIM. And this was in 1998. We invited Tim Berners-Lee, who was the founder of the World Wide Web, to come and be the keynote speaker at AIM, 1998. Keep in mind that Inform article from 1996. Invited him in 1998. A lot of people thought we were nuts. This was still a LAN, local area network based industry. Didn't really have a whole lot to do with the web at that point. But I think we were starting to get a glimmer of the revolution that was in store for us. And Tim used this as an opportunity to talk about the societal impact of what was emerging relative to the web. And what he said at the time was, we need to think about what we're aiming for. And he viewed it this way, very apple pie kinds of goals that I wish we had met, which were a space of information where we share, that we're in equilibrium with, that allows us an opportunity to combine work and play and build a society that we're happy with. And one of the things that went wrong along the way was that we deferred to technology companies in terms of the model that we used to monetize the web because we didn't understand it. And the byproduct of that is a mess when it comes to the World Wide Web and social media and the kinds of divergences that we have within our society. And so another slide that Tim had is that we all have to be thinking about what this next big leap is, because what we do on a day-to-day basis, whether it's in society at large or whether it's in the document and content business or in the process management business, when it comes to thinking about how and under what circumstances do we want to embrace generative AI technologies and large language models into our day-to-day lives, is something that is going to be a complicated set of questions, and one that we shouldn't underestimate the complexity and just defer to the pure technology gurus in order to make that decision. So thank you all very much. Happy to answer questions on, you can contact me at jmancini77@gmail. You can also post comments. I'll post this on LinkedIn. You can take a look at it. But I really appreciate the opportunity at the Document Strategies Forum to put my ideas to bed in terms of thinking about AI, and the opportunity to share it with you all today. Thank you so much.